I am Lydia, 29 years old, and I never thought I would vanish from my entire life in Millbrook without leaving a single trace. But when my father slammed his weathered hands against the mahogany dining table in our family home and demanded I hand over $280,000 to cover my brother Garrett's catastrophic gambling debts, something deep inside my chest finally shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 8 grueling years of being the family's financial safety net, the dependable daughter, the one who always said yes when everyone else had already given up. His words still reverberate through my mind like thunder during a summer storm. Lydia, you need to wire the money by Friday morning. No excuses, no delays, no negotiations. This is family. I looked him directly in the eyes, my voice steady as mountain stone, and simply said, "Of course, Dad. I'll handle it." He had absolutely no idea what those 5 words actually meant, or how they would change everything he thought he knew about his reliable daughter. Before I dive deeper into this story that consumed my life for nearly a decade, drop a comment letting me know which city or country you're watching from right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you've ever been pushed to your absolute breaking point by family expectations that felt impossible to escape. Trust me completely when I say that what happened in the next 72 hours will make you question every single thing you believe about family loyalty, financial obligations, and the price of being the responsible one in a household built on dysfunction. The moment I walked out of that house in Millbrook that Tuesday evening, pretending to head to Westfield Bank to arrange the wire transfer my father demanded, I knew with crystalline clarity that I would never return to that suffocating life again. Instead of driving to the bank, I drove straight to my small but immaculate apartment on Riverside Avenue, pulled out 3 large suitcases, and began the most liberating packing session of my entire existence. You see, this wasn't just about $280,000. This was about a pattern that had been strangling me slowly for years, like ivy growing around a tree until it can no longer breathe. This was about my brother Garrett's endless cycle of promises and disasters, each one more expensive and devastating than the last. This was about my father's iron-fisted expectation that I would always be there to clean up the messes, to sacrifice my dreams, to postpone my own happiness for the sake of keeping our family's reputation intact in our tight-knit community of Millbrook. But most importantly, this was about the $180,000 I had painstakingly saved over 7 years of 60-hour work weeks at Pemberton Financial Services, money that was supposed to fund my dream of opening my own boutique consulting firm in the vibrant city of Newbridge, 3 hours north of our suffocating small town. Money that represented every weekend I spent working instead of dating, every vacation I never took, every designer dress I admired but never bought, every small luxury I denied myself in service of a future that felt so close I could almost touch it. The gambling debt that had brought us to this moment wasn't Garrett's first disaster, or even his 5th. At 26 years old, my younger brother had perfected the art of creating chaos and then disappearing while other people cleaned up the wreckage. There was the failed restaurant venture that cost our family $45,000. There was the car accident where he was driving under the influence, resulting in legal fees and settlements that reached $60,000. There was the credit card fraud incident that somehow became my responsibility to resolve, another $25,000 vanishing from my carefully managed savings account. Each time, the pattern was identical and predictable as clockwork. Garrett would appear at our family dinner table on Sunday evenings, his boyish charm and crocodile tears flowing freely, explaining how this particular disaster wasn't really his fault. How he had been taken advantage of, how he had made one tiny mistake that spiraled beyond his control, how he just needed one more chance to prove he could turn his life around. Our father would listen with that stern expression that fooled everyone except me, and then his eyes would inevitably turn toward me with that look I had learned to dread. "Lydia makes good money at that finance company," he would say, as if my salary was community property rather than the result of my relentless work ethic and carefully planned career moves. "She can help out her little brother just this once." Except it was never just once, and we all knew it, but acknowledging that truth would have required admitting that our family dynamic was fundamentally broken. The most infuriating part wasn't even the money, though watching my life savings evaporate to fund Garrett's recklessness felt like watching my future burn in real time. The most infuriating part was how my parents had constructed this elaborate mythology where Garrett was the victim of circumstances beyond his control, while I was somehow obligated to serve as his personal insurance policy against the consequences of his own choices. My mother, Patricia, would call me separately after these family meetings, her voice heavy with manufactured guilt and emotional manipulation. "You know how your father gets when he's worried about Garrett," she would whisper into the phone, as if she were sharing state secrets. "And you're doing so well for yourself, sweetheart. It's just temporary until Garrett gets back on his feet." But Garrett never got back on his feet because there was always someone there to catch him before he hit the ground hard enough to learn from the impact. This time was different, though. This time, the amount was so staggering that it would have wiped out not just my business savings, but also my emergency fund, my retirement contributions, and the small inheritance I had received from my grandmother's estate. This time, saying yes would have meant sacrificing not just my immediate dreams, but my entire financial security for the foreseeable future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So when my father made his demand with that tone that brooked no argument, expecting the same immediate compliance he had always received, I made a decision that would change everything. I smiled, I agreed, and then I disappeared. What happened next will challenge everything you think you know about family obligation and the courage it takes to save yourself. To understand why I made the decision to vanish completely from Millbrook, you need to know about the toxic ecosystem that was my family. My father, Raymond Ashford, built his moderately successful construction company through sheer determination and an uncompromising belief that respect meant fear. He ran our household the same way he managed his construction crews, with absolute authority, rigid hierarchies, and the expectation that orders would be followed without question or delay. Raymond was the kind of man who believed that love was demonstrated through provision, not affection. He worked 16-hour days, came home exhausted and irritable, and expected dinner on the table and silence from his children unless we were reporting achievements that reflected well on the Ashford name. Emotions were weakness in his world. Tears were manipulation. And questioning his decisions was tantamount to betrayal. My mother Patricia was his perfect complement in this dysfunctional dance. Where Raymond was harsh and demanding, Patricia was soft-spoken and accommodating. She had mastered the art of emotional manipulation disguised as gentle concern, always smoothing over Raymond's rough edges with phrases like, "Your father works so hard for this family," and "We all need to do our part to keep the peace." She was the family's emotional translator, converting Raymond's barked orders into guilt-wrapped requests that somehow felt even more impossible to refuse. Patricia had given up her career as a high school English teacher when Garrett was born, and she poured all of her frustrated ambitions into managing family dynamics like a full-time diplomatic mission. She could sense tension before it erupted and had an arsenal of phrases designed to redirect conflict. "Let's all take a deep breath. We're family, we support each other," and my personal favorite, "Lydia, you know how sensitive Garrett is about these things." Then there was Garrett himself, 3 years younger than me and somehow existing in a completely different universe where consequences were optional and other people always appeared to solve his problems. While I was earning straight A's and working part-time jobs from age 16, Garrett coasted through high school with C's and D's, charming his teachers into giving him extensions and extra credit opportunities that he rarely completed. Garrett had inherited Patricia's emotional intelligence but weaponized it for his own benefit. He could read exactly what each family member needed to hear and deliver it with Oscar-worthy sincerity. With Raymond, he played the role of the struggling son who just needed one more chance to make his father proud. With Patricia, he was the misunderstood artist whose sensitive soul was constantly wounded by an unforgiving world. And with me, he was the grateful little brother who promised that this time would be different. The family mythology painted Garrett as creatively gifted but financially naive, a dreamer who needed protection from a harsh world that didn't appreciate his artistic temperament. The reality was that Garrett had learned early that his charm could open doors and his tears could open wallets, so he had never developed any other life skills. Why learn budgeting when someone else would always cover the shortfall? Why face consequences when someone else would always intervene? Our family operated on an unspoken but rigid hierarchy. Raymond was the undisputed king, making all major decisions and controlling the family's financial resources. Patricia was the queen mother, managing emotions and maintaining family unity at all costs. I was the responsible crown prince, expected to excel academically, professionally, and financially while also serving as backup support for any family crisis. And Garrett was the beloved younger prince, whose failures were reframed as learning experiences and whose successes were celebrated as miraculous achievements. Sunday dinners at the Ashford house were like carefully choreographed performances where everyone played their assigned roles. Raymond would preside from the head of the table, delivering pronouncements about politics, business, and family expectations. Patricia would hover around the edges, making sure everyone's plates were full and tensions were managed. I would report on my latest achievements, promotions, salary increases, savings milestones, which were received with brief nods of approval before the conversation inevitably shifted to Garrett's latest crisis or opportunity. Garrett would arrive fashionably late, usually with some dramatic story about traffic or a dead phone battery, and immediately become the center of attention. He had perfected the art of making his problems sound like temporary setbacks rather than patterns of irresponsibility. A failed business venture became learning valuable entrepreneurial lessons. A gambling loss became investing in networking opportunities at the poker table. A missed payment became cash flow timing issues that any businessman would understand. The most toxic element of our family dynamic was how my success was constantly reframed as a resource for Garrett's failures. My promotion to senior financial advisor wasn't celebrated as my achievement, it was discussed as good news for the family because it meant I could help out more when needed. My careful savings weren't viewed as evidence of my discipline and planning, they were seen as an emergency fund that belonged to the entire family. I had spent years trying to establish boundaries, but they were constantly eroded by family pressure disguised as love. When I suggested that Garrett needed to face natural consequences for his choices, I was accused of being cold and forgetting what family means. When I pointed out that my financial help wasn't actually helping Garrett learn responsibility, I was told I was overthinking things and being too analytical. The pattern had become so normalized that even I sometimes questioned whether I was being unreasonable. Maybe I was too focused on money. Maybe I was too rigid about consequences. Maybe family really did mean always being available to help, regardless of the personal cost. But deep down, I knew that what we called family support was actually a system designed to enable Garrett's irresponsibility while exploiting my sense of duty. This was the toxic ecosystem that had shaped my entire adult life, and it was about to demand the ultimate sacrifice. Years of being trapped in this dysfunctional family system had created a pattern that I was only beginning to recognize in my late 20s. Every major decision in my life had been filtered through the question of how it would affect my ability to serve as the family's financial safety net. I chose my college major in finance not because I was passionate about numbers, but because Raymond constantly reminded me that money skills run the family business. I selected my apartment based on affordability rather than comfort, knowing that every dollar I didn't spend on myself was a dollar available for the next Garrett emergency. The pattern started small during my college years at Westfield University. While my dorm mates were joining sororities and studying abroad, I was working 25 hours a week at the campus bookstore and sending half my earnings home to help with family expenses that mysteriously coincided with Garrett's latest misadventures. When he crashed his first car during my sophomore year, I contributed $3,000 from my summer job savings. When he failed 2 classes and needed expensive tutoring during my junior year, another $2,500 disappeared from my carefully managed student account. Even then, the family mythology was already taking shape. Lydia is so responsible with money, Patricia would tell relatives and family friends, as if my forced frugality was a personality trait rather than a survival mechanism. She's always been mature for her age, Raymond would add, making my premature burden of family financial responsibility sound like a natural gift rather than an imposed obligation. After graduation, I deliberately chose a position at Pemberton Financial Services in Millbrook rather than pursuing better opportunities in larger cities like Newbridge or the state capital. The salary was lower, but staying local meant I could monitor the family situation and respond quickly to crises. What I told myself was family loyalty was actually a form of self-imposed imprisonment, though I wouldn't understand that for several more years. The professional sacrifices became increasingly costly as my career progressed. I turned down a promotion that would have required relocating to the regional headquarters in Hartwell, a move that would have increased my salary by 40% and positioned me for executive-level advancement. When I explained to Raymond that the opportunity would take me 2 hours away from Millbrook, his response was immediate and definitive. Family comes first, Lydia. There will be other promotions. But we both knew that turning down that promotion meant accepting a permanently limited trajectory at the local branch. I also sacrificed countless personal relationships on the altar of family obligation. During my mid-20s, I was dating a wonderful man named Connor who worked as a veterinarian in the neighboring town of Elmridge. Our relationship was progressing towards serious commitment when Garrett's restaurant venture collapsed, requiring weeks of intensive damage control and financial restructuring. I canceled so many dates and cut short so many conversations to handle family emergencies that Connor eventually sat me down for a painful but honest conversation. "Lydia, I care about you deeply, but I feel like I'm dating your entire family, not just you," he said one evening after I had to leave our dinner celebration of his birthday to deal with yet another Garrett crisis. "Every plan we make is subject to cancellation if your brother needs something. Every conversation we have gets interrupted by family phone calls. I need to know if there's room in your life for a relationship that isn't controlled by your family's emergencies." I wanted to promise him that things would change, but I knew I couldn't make that commitment honestly. The family's needs would always take precedence, and Connor deserved better than being a secondary priority in his own relationship. We ended things amicably, but losing him felt like losing a glimpse of what my life could be if I wasn't perpetually on call for family disasters. The romantic sacrifice wasn't just about Connor, though. It became a pattern of starting relationships that I couldn't fully commit to because my emotional and financial resources were constantly diverted to family obligations. Men would initially be understanding about my close family ties, but eventually they would recognize that I wasn't really available for the kind of partnership that healthy relationships require. I was always holding part of myself in reserve for the next Garrett emergency. My social life suffered similarly. Friends would invite me to weekend trips, evening classes, or hobby groups, but I rarely felt free to make commitments that might conflict with family needs. I became the friend who was always potentially available but never reliably present, the one who would enthusiastically agree to plans and then apologetically cancel when family duty called. Over time, the invitations became less frequent, and my social circle shrank to include only the most understanding and patient people. Even my living situation reflected this pattern of sacrifice. When I finally saved enough for a down payment on a small house in Millbrook's historic district, I instead chose to remain in my modest apartment on Riverside Avenue. The house would have been a sound investment and a symbol of my independence, but it would have also tied up capital that might be needed for family emergencies. The apartment kept my overhead low and my savings liquid, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. The most insidious part of this pattern was how it had become invisible to me over time. I no longer consciously thought about the sacrifices I was making, they had become automatic responses to family expectations. When Garrett needed help, I helped. When Raymond demanded compliance, I complied. When Patricia requested my understanding for yet another exception to consequences, I understood. I had become so accustomed to putting my own needs last that I had forgotten I had needs at all. My work colleagues at Pemberton Financial Services began to notice the pattern too, though they didn't understand its source. My supervisor, Janet Clearwater, pulled me aside after I had missed my third professional development conference in 2 years due to family emergencies. "Lydia, you're one of our most talented advisors, but you're not investing in your own professional growth," she said with genuine concern. "These conferences aren't just nice-to-have events, they're where industry connections are made and career opportunities emerge. I'm worried that you're limiting your own potential." She was right, of course, but I couldn't explain that my family operated like a corporation where I was simultaneously the emergency fund, the crisis management team, and the insurance policy. Admitting that would have meant acknowledging how completely my life had been consumed by other people's choices and emergencies. The financial cost of this pattern was staggering when I finally calculated it during a sleepless night following Garrett's credit card fraud incident. Over 7 years, I had contributed over $130,000 to various family crises, not including the opportunity costs of declined promotions, missed networking events, and career limitations imposed by staying in Millbrook. That money could have funded graduate school, a house down payment, international travel, or the business consulting firm I dreamed of opening. But more devastating than the financial cost was the psychological toll of living in constant anticipation of the next crisis. I had developed what I now recognize as hypervigilance, always scanning for signs of trouble, always keeping my phone nearby in case emergency calls came through. I slept poorly, constantly worried about what disaster might be brewing. I couldn't fully enjoy successes or celebrations because I knew they would likely be interrupted by family obligations. The pattern had become so entrenched that I couldn't imagine life without it, which made the upcoming $280,000 demand feel both shocking and inevitable. This was simply the logical endpoint of a trajectory that had been building for nearly a decade. The specific incidents that led to this breaking point didn't happen overnight. They unfolded over 4 years like a carefully orchestrated symphony of escalating financial destruction, each movement more expensive and devastating than the last. What made these incidents particularly infuriating wasn't just their cost, but the predictable cycle of Garrett's promises, failures, and my family's expectation that I would clean up the mess without complaint. The first major financial disaster struck during the summer when Garrett was 22. He had been working as a server at various restaurants around Millbrook, charming customers and earning decent tips, but never staying anywhere long enough to build real career momentum. One evening over Sunday dinner, he announced with his characteristic enthusiasm that he was going to open his own restaurant with his friend Kevin Thornfield, who allegedly had connections in the hospitality industry. "It's going to be a sports bar with elevated comfort food," Garrett explained, his eyes lighting up with the manic energy that always preceded his disasters. "Kevin knows this investor who's willing to put up most of the money, but we need $45,000 for the initial equipment and licensing fees. It's basically a guaranteed return on investment." Raymond seemed skeptical but intrigued by the business potential. "What kind of timeline are we talking about, and what's your business plan?" Garrett pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper with what appeared to be revenue projections written in his messy handwriting. The numbers were wildly optimistic, assuming packed houses 7 nights a week and profit margins that defied restaurant industry realities. But Raymond had always harbored dreams of expanding beyond construction, and the idea of his son running a successful business appealed to his entrepreneurial instincts. "I think it has potential," Raymond declared after reviewing Garrett's amateur financial projections. "But you need startup capital to make it happen properly." That's when both my parents turned toward me with expressions I had learned to dread. "Lydia, you've been doing so well at the financial firm," Patricia began in her carefully modulated voice. "Maybe you could help Garrett get started? It would be like an investment in his future." I tried to raise practical concerns about Garrett's lack of restaurant experience, the notorious failure rate of new restaurants, and the questionable credentials of his mysterious business partner. But my objections were dismissed as pessimism and lack of family support. "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks," Raymond explained, as if lending money to my irresponsible brother was equivalent to a diversified investment portfolio. The pressure campaign lasted 3 weeks. Patricia would call me at work with updates on Garrett's excitement and stress about the opportunity. "He's so motivated, Lydia. This could really be the thing that turns his life around." Raymond would mention during casual conversations how proud he was that his children were in positions to help each other succeed. Even Garrett himself would text me articles about successful restaurant entrepreneurs, accompanied by messages like, "This could be us, sis." Finally, I transferred $45,000 from my savings to Garrett's account, telling myself it really could be an investment in his future stability. The restaurant, called Thornfield's Tavern, opened 4 months later in a strip mall location that required customers to park behind a dry cleaner. The grand opening was well attended by family and friends, and for about 6 weeks, it seemed like maybe this venture might actually succeed. But Garrett had no understanding of restaurant operations beyond the customer service aspect. He couldn't manage inventory, had no systems for controlling food costs, and treated the cash register like his personal ATM for drinks with friends and impromptu purchases. Kevin Thornfield turned out to be equally inexperienced and primarily interested in using the restaurant as his personal party venue. Within 3 months, they were behind on rent, utilities, and vendor payments. The restaurant limped along for another 5 months before finally closing, leaving behind $23,000 in unpaid debts and a bitter landlord who threatened legal action. My $45,000 investment vanished completely, along with any illusion that Garrett might actually learn from this expensive lesson. Instead of taking responsibility for the failure, Garrett blamed Kevin's poor management, the difficult location, and the unsupportive local business environment. The second major incident occurred just 18 months later and involved Garrett's romantic life rather than his entrepreneurial ambitions. He had been dating a woman named Cassandra Wells, who came from one of Millbrook's wealthier families. Her father owned 3 auto dealerships across the county, and Cassandra had grown up with expensive tastes and unlimited access to family resources. Garrett was completely captivated by this lifestyle and spent months trying to keep up with Cassandra's spending habits. He took her to expensive restaurants in the city, bought her jewelry he couldn't afford, and even leased a luxury car to match her BMW. The relationship lasted 8 months and cost him approximately $35,000 in credit card debt, which he accumulated across 7 different cards by using cash advances from one to make minimum payments on others. When Cassandra eventually broke up with him, apparently her family had made it clear that Garrett wasn't marriage material. He spiraled into what Patricia diagnosed as depression but what I recognized as a narcissistic rage at being rejected. Instead of accepting the breakup and focusing on paying down his debt, Garrett decided that winning Cassandra back required even more dramatic gestures. He used the last of his available credit to buy her a $8,000 engagement ring and orchestrated an elaborate public proposal at Millbrook's annual Harvest Festival, where half the town was present to witness his humiliation. Cassandra not only said no but had her father escort Garrett away from the festival grounds while threatening to call the police if he continued to harass their family. This public rejection sent Garrett into a genuine crisis. He couldn't show his face around town without people whispering about the failed proposal. He couldn't return the engagement ring because he had bought it from a jewelry store that had a no-return policy on custom pieces. And he couldn't make even the minimum payments on his credit cards because he had already maxed out every available line of credit. The harassment calls from collection agencies began within weeks. Garrett would forward these calls to Patricia, who would work herself into panic attacks about the family's reputation in the community. "People are going to think we raised our children poorly," she would sob during her phone calls to me. "Your father's business could be affected if people think the Ashford family doesn't pay their debts." Raymond's approach was more direct. "Garrett made some mistakes, but the damage is done. Now we need to fix it before it gets worse. These collection agencies will garnish his wages and ruin his credit permanently." The pressure campaign for this bailout was more intense because it involved the family's public reputation rather than just private financial consequences. I was reminded constantly that Garrett's debt problems reflected on all of us, that my success meant I had a responsibility to protect the family name, and that $60,000 was a small price to pay for preserving years of Raymond's hard work building his business reputation. I negotiated payment plans with 3 collection agencies and paid off 4 credit cards in full, draining another significant portion of my carefully accumulated savings. Garrett promised to cut up all his credit cards and start attending financial planning counseling, promises that lasted approximately 6 weeks before he was approved for new cards using his improved credit score. The third major incident occurred just 8 months ago and demonstrated that Garrett had learned nothing from his previous disasters except how to create even more expensive problems. This time, he had discovered online poker and convinced himself that his natural charm and intuition made him a gifted card player destined for professional success. For 3 months, he spent every evening playing online poker tournaments, treating the laptop in his bedroom like a home office for his new career. Initially, he actually won more often than he lost, which convinced him that he had found his calling as a professional gambler. Patricia bragged to her friends about Garrett's poker winnings as if he had discovered a new form of employment rather than developed a dangerous addiction. But gambling addiction follows predictable patterns, and Garrett's lucky streak was followed by increasingly desperate attempts to win back his losses. He started borrowing money from friends to fund larger bets, convinced that one big win would solve all his problems. When he exhausted his social network, he turned to online lending platforms that charged predatory interest rates but promised quick approval for debt consolidation loans. Within 2 months, Garrett had accumulated $95,000 in gambling debt spread across online platforms, peer-to-peer lending sites, and several local individuals who were considerably less patient than traditional creditors. Some of these creditors made it clear that they expected repayment through methods that didn't involve the legal system, which sent Patricia into hysterics and Raymond into a cold fury. "This isn't just about money anymore," Raymond told me during a tense private conversation. Some of these people Garrett owes money to aren't the kind who take no for an answer. This could become a safety issue for our entire family. The bailout for this incident required $95,000 to satisfy the most threatening creditors and another $15,000 for a residential gambling addiction treatment program that Garrett attended for exactly 3 weeks before declaring himself cured and ready to return to normal life. But normal life for Garrett apparently included returning to the very casinos and online platforms that had created the problem in the first place, setting the stage for the $280,000 catastrophe that would finally break me. Despite the financial hemorrhaging caused by Garrett's endless crises, my own life had finally begun to flourish in ways that felt almost miraculous after years of sacrifice and disappointment. For the first time since college, I was building something that belonged entirely to me, creating a future that wasn't contingent on my family's approval or dependent on their emergencies. The irony wasn't lost on me that just as I was beginning to taste real independence and success, the universe was preparing to test my resolve with the ultimate family crisis. My career at Pemberton Financial Services had reached a pivotal moment that felt like validation for all the professional sacrifices I had made. After 7 years of consistent performance, client retention rates that exceeded company averages, and revenue generation that placed me in the top 5% of advisors statewide, I was finally being considered for promotion to Senior Portfolio Manager. This wasn't just a title change, it represented a 45% salary increase, equity participation in the firm, and most importantly, the autonomy to build my own client base without constant oversight. Janet Clearwater had called me into her office on a Thursday morning in early March with news that made my hands shake with excitement. "Lydia, the partners have been reviewing performance metrics for the Senior Portfolio Manager position, and your name is at the top of our list. We're planning to make the announcement at the quarterly meeting next month, but I wanted to give you advance notice so you can start thinking about your client development strategy." This promotion represented more than professional advancement, it was my pathway to eventual independence from Pemberton Financial Services altogether. Senior portfolio managers at firms like ours often leverage their experience and client relationships to launch independent consulting practices, and I had been quietly researching the requirements for exactly that transition. The increased salary and equity participation would provide the financial foundation I needed to eventually strike out on my own. Even more significantly, my personal life had taken an unexpected turn toward genuine happiness with someone who seemed to understand and respect my complicated family situation without being intimidated by it. I had met Daniel Reeves 6 months earlier at a professional networking event in Newbridge, where he was presenting on sustainable investment strategies for his environmental consulting firm. Daniel was everything that my previous relationships had lacked: financially stable, emotionally mature, and refreshingly direct about his expectations and boundaries. What drew me to Daniel initially wasn't just his intelligence or his calm presence, but his ability to listen to my family's stories without immediately offering solutions or judgments. He had grown up in a military family where boundaries and personal responsibility were non-negotiable values, so he understood both the importance of family loyalty and the danger of enabling destructive behavior. When I told him about Garrett's various disasters, Daniel's response was measured and thoughtful rather than dismissive or overly sympathetic. "It sounds like your family has confused love with rescue operations," he observed during one of our early conversations. "Real love sometimes means letting people face the natural consequences of their choices, even when it's painful to watch." Our relationship had progressed to the point where we were seriously discussing moving in together, potentially in Newbridge where Daniel's business was located. This would have meant leaving Millbrook for the first time in my adult life, establishing physical distance from my family's constant emergencies, and building a life that prioritized my own happiness rather than everyone else's crises. Daniel had even begun looking at properties that could accommodate both his home office and the consulting practice I dreamed of launching. But the most exciting development in my life was the near completion of my business fund, a carefully managed account that represented 7 years of aggressive saving and strategic investment. After all the family bailouts, missed opportunities, and financial sacrifices, I had still managed to accumulate $180,000 specifically designated for launching Ashford Financial Consulting. This wasn't just money, it was my declaration of independence, my ticket to professional autonomy, and my proof that I could build something significant despite my family's constant financial demands. I had spent months developing a comprehensive business plan for the consulting firm, researching market opportunities in the Newbridge area, and even identifying potential office space in a professional complex that catered to small financial services businesses. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: leverage my 7 years of experience at Pemberton Financial Services to offer personalized financial planning and investment advice to middle-market clients who were underserved by larger firms. My target market consisted of small business owners, young professionals, and families who needed more sophisticated financial guidance than basic banking products could provide, but who didn't meet the asset minimums that larger wealth management firms required. I had identified a genuine gap in the market and positioned myself to fill it with a combination of personal service, competitive fees, and the kind of attention to detail that had made me successful at Pemberton Financial Services. The business plan projected profitability within 18 months and the potential for 6-figure annual revenue within 3 years. More importantly, it represented complete ownership of my professional destiny for the first time in my adult life. No more family emergencies interrupting client meetings. No more guilt about prioritizing career advancement over family obligations. No more wondering whether my success existed primarily to fund other people's failures. I had even begun taking steps toward implementation that felt thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. I had scheduled meetings with 2 potential business mentors through the Newbridge Small Business Development Center. I had researched commercial insurance requirements and begun the paperwork for establishing an LLC. I had started building a website and developing marketing materials that reflected my vision for personalized, relationship-based financial consulting. Daniel had been incredibly supportive throughout this planning process, offering both emotional encouragement and practical advice based on his own experience launching an independent consulting practice. He understood the courage required to leave the security of steady employment for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship, and he never made me feel like my dreams were unrealistic or overly ambitious. "You're already doing the work," he would remind me when I expressed doubts about making the transition. "You're just going to be doing it for your own clients instead of Pemberton Financial Services clients. The hardest part is making the decision to prioritize your own success." We had even begun discussing the possibility of coordinating our business launches, with his environmental consulting firm and my financial planning practice potentially sharing office space and referring clients to each other when appropriate. The synergy between our professional goals felt like evidence that I was finally building a life based on mutual support rather than one-sided sacrifice. My social life had also begun to expand beyond the narrow confines that family obligations had previously imposed. Daniel's friend group included other young professionals who were building careers and relationships based on shared values rather than geographical proximity or family connections. For the first time in years, I was part of weekend plans that weren't subject to cancellation due to family emergencies. I was developing friendships with people who knew me as Lydia, the successful financial advisor and entrepreneur, not Lydia, the family fixer and perpetual bailout fund. I had even begun planning a celebration trip to mark the launch of Ashford Financial Consulting, researching a 2-week vacation to Ireland that would serve as both a personal reward for years of sacrifice and a symbolic transition into this new phase of my life. The trip represented everything I had been working toward: financial independence, professional autonomy, and the freedom to make decisions based on my own desires rather than family expectations. But most significantly, I had begun to envision a future where family emergencies were not my emergencies, where Garrett's poor choices were not my financial responsibility, and where my success was not automatically considered community property. This vision felt both liberating and terrifying, because it required acknowledging how completely my previous life had been organized around other people's needs. All of these positive developments, the promotion, the relationship, the business plan, the growing independence, were converging into a moment of unprecedented possibility in my life. For the first time since college, I could see a clear path toward the kind of life I actually wanted rather than the life my family expected me to live. Which made the timing of Garrett's $280,000 gambling catastrophe feel like a cosmic test of whether I had the courage to choose my own future over my family's demands. The call that would destroy everything I had built came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in late September. I was at Daniel's apartment in Newbridge, reviewing final drafts of my business license applications while he worked on a proposal for a sustainable energy project. We had spent the evening planning our coordinated office space and discussing the timeline for my transition from Pemberton Financial Services to independent consulting. Life felt perfect, balanced, and entirely under my control. When my phone buzzed with Raymond's name, my stomach immediately clenched with familiar dread. Family calls after 11 p.m. never brought good news, and the timing felt especially ominous given how well everything else was going in my life. Daniel looked up from his laptop with concern as I hesitated before answering. Lydia. Raymond's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. Family meeting tomorrow morning. 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. Dad, I have client presentations all morning, I replied automatically, already knowing the response I would receive. Can we discuss whatever this is over the phone? No. This requires face-to-face discussion. Cancel your meetings. The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone with a mixture of anger and anxiety that immediately transported me back to feeling like a powerless teenager rather than a successful adult professional. Daniel set aside his laptop and moved to sit beside me on the couch. Family emergency, he asked gently, reading my expression with the accuracy that came from 6 months of learning my emotional patterns. Apparently. Though with my family, emergency is a relative term that can mean anything from actual crisis to minor inconvenience that requires my immediate attention. I was trying to keep my tone light, but Daniel could hear the underlying tension that these family summons always triggered. Do you want me to drive you there tomorrow? He offered, though we both knew that introducing him into whatever crisis was brewing would only complicate an already difficult situation. I declined his offer but appreciated the support, spending a restless night wondering what new disaster Garrett had created and how much it would cost me this time. Based on the tone of Raymond's voice and the urgency of the meeting, I suspected this crisis would be significantly more expensive than the previous ones. I arrived at the family house on Maple Street at exactly 7 a.m., steeling myself as I walked up the familiar brick pathway lined with Patricia's carefully maintained flower beds. The house looked deceptively peaceful in the early morning light, giving no hint of the emotional warfare that was about to unfold inside its walls. The moment I stepped through the front door, the atmosphere hit me like entering a pressure chamber. Patricia was pacing the living room in her bathrobe, occasionally wringing her hands and muttering phrases like, "I don't know how this happened," and, "What are the neighbors going to think?" Raymond sat rigidly in his leather recliner, fully dressed despite the early hour, his face set in the grim expression he wore when dealing with serious business problems. Garrett was sprawled on the sectional sofa, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually carefully styled hair was disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled as if he had slept in them, and his eyes were red-rimmed with what appeared to be a combination of exhaustion and terror. For the first time in any of our family crisis meetings, Garrett looked genuinely afraid rather than simply contrite. "What's going on?" I asked, remaining standing with my purse still over my shoulder, unconsciously maintaining physical distance from whatever emotional quicksand was about to engulf the room. Raymond gestured toward Garrett with the kind of controlled motion that suggested he was fighting the urge to use his hands for more violent purposes. "Tell your sister what you've done." Garrett looked up at me with an expression that combined genuine fear with his familiar manipulative pleading. "Lydia, I need you to know that this wasn't supposed to happen like this. I had a system, I was actually winning for a while, but then..." "How much?" I interrupted, cutting through what I knew would be a lengthy explanation designed to minimize his responsibility and maximize my sympathy. "Whatever this is about, just tell me how much money is involved." $280,000, Garrett whispered, the number hanging in the room like a toxic cloud that poisoned the air around us. I felt my knees weaken and had to grab the back of Patricia's favorite chair to maintain my balance. The amount was so staggering that my brain initially refused to process it as real. $280,000? How is that even possible? The story that emerged over the next hour was a masterclass in escalating poor decisions and addictive behavior that had spiraled completely out of control. After his supposedly successful rehabilitation following the previous gambling incident, Garrett had initially stayed away from casinos and online poker sites for about 3 months. But instead of addressing the underlying psychological issues that drove his gambling addiction, he had simply transferred his compulsive behavior to cryptocurrency speculation and high-stakes sports betting. Garrett had convinced himself that cryptocurrency trading was a legitimate investment strategy rather than gambling, allowing him to rationalize behavior that was fundamentally identical to his poker addiction. He started with small amounts, watching YouTube videos and reading online forums that promised easy profits for anyone smart enough to understand market patterns. Initially, he experienced some modest successes that convinced him he had discovered a reliable path to financial independence. The cryptocurrency speculation escalated when Garrett met a group of men at a sports bar in the next town who claimed to be professional traders making six-figure annual profits through coordinated buying and selling strategies. They invited him to join their private Discord server where they shared insider information about upcoming market movements and coordinated group investments designed to manipulate smaller cryptocurrency values. What Garrett didn't understand was that he had stumbled into a sophisticated pump-and-dump scheme where experienced scammers identified naive newcomers and systematically extracted their money through fake investment opportunities and manipulated market information. The group would coordinate purchases of obscure cryptocurrencies to artificially inflate their values, then sell their positions before encouraging newcomers like Garrett to invest larger amounts just before the inevitable crash. Over 6 months, Garrett had borrowed money from increasingly dangerous sources to fund what he believed were guaranteed investment opportunities. He started with traditional credit cards and personal loans, but when his credit was exhausted, he turned to peer-to-peer lending platforms that charged predatory interest rates. When those sources were depleted, he began borrowing from individuals who operated outside the traditional banking system and had very different approaches to debt collection. The final catastrophe occurred when Garrett's cryptocurrency trading group convinced him to invest in what they claimed was a revolutionary new digital currency that was about to be adopted by a major technology company. They provided fake documentation showing projected returns of 400% within 3 months and encouraged him to go all in on this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Garrett borrowed $150,000 from a network of private lenders, adding to the existing $130,000 he owed from previous cryptocurrency speculation, believing he would be able to repay everything and still profit significantly when the investment matured. Instead, the entire cryptocurrency turned out to be completely fabricated, existing only on fake websites designed to steal investors' money. Within 48 hours of his final investment, all the websites disappeared, the Discord server was deleted, and Garrett's trading partners were nowhere to be found. Now he owed $280,000 to a collection of creditors who ranged from legitimate lending companies to individuals who had made it clear that they expected repayment on their original timeline regardless of Garrett's circumstances. Some of these creditors had already begun making threats that extended beyond financial consequences, mentioning specific details about our family's daily routines that suggested they had been conducting surveillance. "They know where Patricia works," Raymond said, his voice barely controlled. "They know what time you leave for work in the morning. They know about your apartment on Riverside Avenue." This isn't just about Garrett anymore, they're treating this like a family debt. The most terrifying aspect of the situation was the timeline. The most dangerous creditors expected full repayment within 1 week, and they had made it clear that failure to meet this deadline would result in consequences that went far beyond damaged credit scores or wage garnishment. These were people who operated entirely outside the legal system and had their own methods for collecting debts. Patricia was alternating between panic attacks and attempts to minimize the situation, as if the right combination of words could somehow make the problem smaller. "Maybe we could negotiate payment plans," she suggested desperately. "Or maybe there are legal protections against these kinds of threats." But Raymond and I both understood that traditional debt management strategies didn't apply when dealing with criminals who had no interest in following legal procedures. These creditors wanted their money immediately, and they had resources and methods that made their threats credible and terrifying. "We need $280,000 by Friday," Raymond stated flatly, looking directly at me with an expression that made his expectations unmistakably clear. "This is not a request, Lydia. This is a family survival situation." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket, and I realized that every positive development in my life, the promotion, the relationship with Daniel, the business plans, the carefully saved money, was about to be sacrificed on the altar of Garrett's addictive behavior and my family's refusal to let him face natural consequences. The silence that followed Raymond's ultimatum stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds. During those moments, I experienced what I can only describe as a complete mental reorganization, as if my brain was rapidly calculating probabilities, consequences, and alternatives at superhuman speed. Every fiber of my being understood that this was the moment that would define the rest of my life, regardless of what decision I made. "I need to think about this," I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "This is a massive amount of money, and I need to understand all the options before making any commitments." Raymond's face darkened immediately. "There's nothing to think about, Lydia. This is family. These people aren't going to wait while you analyze spreadsheets and consider alternatives. We need action, not analysis." But I had already begun formulating a plan that none of them could have anticipated, a plan that had crystallized the moment I realized my family's definition of love required the complete destruction of my future. "I understand the urgency, Dad. Give me 24 hours to arrange the transfer. I'll need to liquidate some investments and coordinate with multiple accounts." Patricia's relief was immediate and overwhelming. She rushed over to embrace me, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I knew we could count on you, sweetheart. You're saving our entire family." Garrett looked up from the sofa with an expression of grateful amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe that his latest disaster was going to be resolved with the same magical efficiency as all his previous crises. "Lydia, I swear this is the last time. I'm going to get serious help for the gambling addiction, and I'll pay you back every penny. This is my rock bottom." I smiled and nodded at all the appropriate moments, playing the role of the dutiful daughter and reliable sister one final time. But internally, I was already executing a completely different script, one where I was the protagonist of my own story rather than a supporting character in everyone else's drama. I left the family meeting with promises to call them the next evening with confirmation of the wire transfer. I hugged Patricia goodbye and told Raymond I appreciated him trusting me to handle such an important family responsibility. I even squeezed Garrett's shoulder and told him I believed this could be his turning point if he was serious about getting help. But instead of driving to Pemberton Financial Services to begin liquidating my accounts, I drove straight to my apartment on Riverside Avenue and began the most liberating packing session of my life. Everything I truly valued fit into 3 suitcases and 2 boxes: essential clothing, important documents, a few sentimental items, my laptop, and some books. Everything else, furniture, kitchen appliances, decorative items, the accumulation of 7 years of adult life in Millbrook, I left behind like artifacts from someone else's existence. The physical act of packing felt symbolic and cathartic. Each item I chose to take represented my authentic self, while everything I left behind represented the person I had been molded into by family expectations and emotional manipulation. I kept the professional clothes that reflected my competence and ambition. I left behind the family dinner outfits that had costumed me for countless performances of grateful compliance. While packing, I made a series of phone calls that felt like cutting anchor chains that had kept me tethered in place for years. I called Janet Clearwater at Pemberton Financial Services and explained that I was accepting a position with another firm effective immediately, thanking her for her mentorship and promising to provide detailed transition notes for my clients. She was surprised but professional, wishing me well in my next opportunity. I called my landlord and explained that I would be terminating my lease early, offering to forfeit my security deposit to avoid any complications. I called the utility companies to schedule disconnection of services. I even called my auto insurance company to change my address to Daniel's apartment in Newbridge, though I hadn't yet told him about my decision to disappear entirely from my family's life. The most difficult call was to Daniel, not because I doubted his support, but because I needed to explain a decision that I had made in emotional survival mode rather than through our usual process of careful discussion and mutual planning. When I told him what had happened at the family meeting and what I was planning to do, his response was immediate and unwavering. "I'll be there in 2 hours," he said without hesitation. "We can fit everything in my truck, and you can stay at my place while we figure out the next steps. Lydia, I'm proud of you for choosing yourself for once." His instant support and lack of judgment about my decision to abandon my family felt like validation that I was making the right choice, possibly for the first time in my adult life. This wasn't just about escaping financial exploitation, it was about choosing a relationship and a future based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. By Wednesday evening, I had executed the logistical aspects of my disappearance with the same methodical efficiency that had made me successful in financial planning. My belongings were relocated to Daniel's apartment in Newbridge, my mail was forwarded to his address, and my local ties to Millbrook were severed as cleanly as possible. But the emotional component of vanishing required one final performance that tested every acting skill I had developed through years of family diplomacy. I called Raymond on Thursday evening, exactly 24 hours after our family meeting, to deliver the news that would shatter their expectations and force them to confront reality without me as their safety net. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I've realized that I can't provide the money for Garrett's debt, I said, my voice calm and steady despite the magnitude of what I was saying. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening, followed by an explosion of disbelief and rage that I had anticipated but still found shocking in its intensity. What do you mean you can't provide the money? We discussed this yesterday. You agreed to help. I agreed to think about it, and I have. I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing my finances and considering all the options, and I've concluded that I cannot and will not liquidate my entire future to pay for Garrett's gambling addiction. This has to stop somewhere, and it stops now. Raymond's voice became dangerously quiet, the tone he used when his authority was being challenged in ways that threatened his entire worldview. Lydia, if you don't help your brother, you are destroying this family. These people will hurt him. They might hurt all of us. How can you live with that on your conscience? The same way you've lived with expecting me to sacrifice my entire life for Garrett's poor choices, I replied, surprised by my own courage. The same way you've lived with teaching him that his actions don't have consequences because someone else will always fix his problems. I'm done being the family insurance policy. What followed was a 20-minute conversation that alternated between threats, manipulation, guilt, and desperate pleading. Raymond threatened to disown me and ensure that I would never be welcome in the family again. Patricia took the phone and sobbed about how disappointed she was in my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. Even Garrett got on the line to promise that he would pay me back with interest if I would just help him this one final time. But for the first time in my adult life, I remained unmoved by their emotional manipulation tactics. Every threat they made sounded like liberation rather than punishment. Being disowned by a family that valued me only as a financial resource felt like freedom rather than loss. Never being welcome at family gatherings where I was expected to fund everyone else's problems sounded like the best possible outcome. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said when their arguments were exhausted. I hope Garrett finds the help he needs, and I hope you all find ways to support him that don't involve destroying other people's lives. But I won't be participating in this family dynamic anymore. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked all their numbers, changed my own phone number, and deactivated my social media accounts. Within 48 hours of Raymond's original ultimatum, I had disappeared from Millbrook and from my family's life as completely as if I had never existed. The most surprising aspect of this disappearance was how natural it felt, as if I had been preparing for this moment my entire adult life without realizing it. All those years of financial discipline, professional development, and emotional independence had positioned me perfectly to walk away when the moment required it. I was finally free to discover who I could become when I wasn't constantly managing other people's crises and funding other people's failures. The immediate aftermath of my disappearance created a ripple effect throughout Millbrook that I only learned about months later through careful observation and strategic information gathering. For the first time in decades, the Ashford family was forced to confront their dysfunction without me serving as their emotional shock absorber and financial safety net. The results were initially chaotic, then surprisingly transformative in ways that none of us could have predicted. Within 48 hours of my vanishing act, my family's carefully constructed mythology began to collapse under the weight of reality. Without my $280,000 bailout, they were forced to explore alternatives that they had never seriously considered while I was available to solve their problems. Raymond, who had spent years treating my savings account like a family emergency fund, suddenly found himself researching bankruptcy attorneys and debt consolidation services. The most immediate change was that Garrett was forced to face the natural consequences of his gambling addiction for the first time in his adult life. Without my financial rescue, he had no choice but to enter a court-mandated debt restructuring program that required him to surrender all his assets, move back into my parents' house, and submit to intensive financial counseling and gambling addiction treatment. More importantly, the dangerous creditors who had been threatening our family's safety were referred to law enforcement when Garrett finally admitted that he had been victimized by an organized cryptocurrency scam. Rather than treating his debts as legitimate obligations that the family needed to honor, investigators recognized them as the product of criminal fraud and began pursuing the scammers rather than pressuring Garrett for repayment. This revelation transformed Garrett from an irresponsible gambler into a crime victim, which shifted my family's emotional narrative in ways that actually supported his recovery rather than enabling his addiction. Instead of feeling ashamed about his poor choices, he could focus on healing from the psychological manipulation he had experienced while building genuine financial literacy and personal responsibility skills. Raymond was forced to make the most dramatic adjustments to his lifestyle and expectations. For 25 years, he had operated his construction business with the confidence that came from knowing his daughter's savings could cover any unexpected expenses or cash flow problems. Without that safety net, he was compelled to implement conservative financial management practices that he had previously considered unnecessary. He downsized his business operations, eliminated unnecessary overhead, and established a genuine emergency fund rather than relying on my resources for crisis management. Most significantly, he was forced to acknowledge that his authoritarian parenting style had created a son who couldn't function independently and a daughter who had fled rather than continue enabling family dysfunction. Patricia underwent perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. For years, she had defined her role as the family peacekeeper who smoothed over conflicts and maintained artificial harmony by pressuring me to accommodate everyone else's needs. Without me available to absorb family stress, she was forced to develop direct communication skills and establish boundaries that she had never learned to set. She returned to work for the first time in over 20 years, taking a position as a part-time administrative assistant at Millbrook Elementary School. This job provided not just supplemental income to replace my financial contributions, but also a sense of personal identity and accomplishment that had been missing since she gave up her teaching career to focus on family management. Most importantly, Patricia began attending Al-Anon meetings to address her role as an enabler in Garrett's addiction. Through this program, she learned to distinguish between supporting family members and rescuing them from the consequences of their choices. For the first time, she began setting limits on how much emotional energy she would invest in managing other people's problems. The changes in my family's dynamics became apparent through a letter that Patricia sent to my old address 6 months after my disappearance. My former landlord forwarded it to Daniel's apartment, where I discovered it contained a level of self-awareness and accountability that I had never heard from my mother before. I have spent the last 6 months learning about enabling behavior and family addiction patterns, she wrote in her careful handwriting. I realize now that what we called love was actually a form of control, and what we called family support was actually exploitation of your generosity and sense of responsibility. The letter detailed specific changes that had occurred in their household since my departure. Garrett had been sober from gambling for 4 months and was working 2 part-time jobs while attending community college classes in business management. He had moved into a studio apartment that he could afford on his own income and was making regular payments toward his remaining legitimate debts. Raymond had joined a support group for families affected by addiction and was learning to separate his business success from his children's life choices. He had also begun attending therapy to address what Patricia described as anger management issues and control problems that affected our entire family dynamic. Most surprisingly, Patricia reported that their marriage had improved significantly once they stopped organizing their entire lives around managing Garrett's crises and my responses to them. "We're learning to be partners again instead of crisis management teammates," she wrote. "We're rediscovering conversation topics that don't involve family emergencies or financial planning." The letter contained no requests for my return, no attempts to minimize the family's previous behavior, and no suggestions that I owed them forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, it focused on acknowledging the damage that had been done and taking responsibility for the changes they were making independently. "I don't know if you will ever want to have a relationship with us again," Patricia concluded. "I wouldn't blame you if the answer is no. But I wanted you to know that your courage in walking away forced us to become the people we should have been all along. You saved yourself, but you also saved us from continuing to destroy ourselves through dysfunction." Meanwhile, my own healing process was unfolding in ways that felt both challenging and liberating. Living with Daniel in Newbridge allowed me to experience daily life without the constant underlying anxiety about the next family crisis. For the first time in years, I could make plans without wondering whether they would be interrupted by emergency phone calls or demands for financial assistance. The transition wasn't entirely smooth. I discovered that years of hypervigilance and people-pleasing had left me with anxiety patterns that didn't disappear just because I had removed myself from the toxic environment that created them. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and codependency, learning to recognize and interrupt the thought patterns that had kept me trapped in dysfunctional relationship dynamics. One of the most difficult aspects of my healing was learning to trust my own judgment about relationships and boundaries. Years of being told that my concerns were selfish and my boundaries were evidence of lack of family loyalty had left me doubting my ability to distinguish between reasonable requests and manipulative demands. Daniel proved invaluable during this adjustment period, not just as emotional support but as a model for how healthy relationships function. He respected my need for space and time to process my family trauma without taking my emotional distance personally. He supported my decision to maintain no contact with my family without pressuring me to either reconcile or permanently sever ties. Most importantly, he helped me launch Ashford Financial Consulting 6 months after my disappearance from Millbrook. The business became both a professional success and a symbol of my ability to build something positive from the wreckage of my family relationships. Having my own consulting practice allowed me to help other people manage their finances without sacrificing my own financial security in the process. The irony wasn't lost on me that disappearing from my family's life had ultimately benefited everyone involved. They were forced to develop independence and accountability skills that my enabling had prevented them from learning. I was free to build a life based on my own values and priorities rather than constantly managing other people's emergencies. For the first time in my adult life, I was living according to my own definition of success rather than trying to meet expectations that would have required the complete sacrifice of my personal happiness and financial security. The lessons that emerged from my journey to independence crystallized over the following year into a philosophy that fundamentally changed how I approached every relationship and decision in my life. These weren't abstract concepts learned from books or therapy sessions, but hard-won insights that came from living through the complete destruction and reconstruction of my understanding of family, love, and personal responsibility. The first and most crucial lesson was that healthy boundaries are not selfish barriers designed to keep people away, but essential frameworks that allow genuine relationships to flourish. For years, I had confused having no boundaries with being loving and supportive, believing that true family loyalty meant being available for any request at any time regardless of the personal cost. I learned that relationships built on unlimited access to another person's resources, whether financial, emotional, or temporal, are fundamentally exploitative rather than loving. Real love, I discovered, actually requires boundaries because it respects the other person's autonomy and dignity enough to allow them to experience natural consequences and develop personal strength. By constantly rescuing Garrett from his poor choices, I hadn't been protecting him, I had been preventing him from developing the resilience and wisdom that only come from facing difficulties independently. The second transformative insight was understanding the difference between helping and enabling, a distinction that seems obvious in theory but becomes remarkably blurry when you're emotionally invested in someone's well-being. Helping involves providing support that increases someone's capacity to solve their own problems. Enabling involves providing support that eliminates the need for someone to solve their own problems. Every time I paid off Garrett's debts, I was enabling him to continue gambling without facing financial consequences. Every time I canceled my own plans to handle family emergencies, I was enabling my parents to avoid developing direct communication and problem-solving skills. My well-intentioned assistance had actually been undermining everyone's ability to develop independence and competence. This realization led to a third crucial understanding about the nature of family relationships in adulthood. The family structures that work for children become toxic when applied to adult relationships because they assume permanent inequality and dependence rather than evolving toward mutual respect and reciprocity. Healthy adult family relationships require the same boundaries and respect that characterize healthy friendships or professional partnerships. My family had never made this transition from parent-child dynamics to adult-adult relationships. Raymond continued treating me like a child whose resources he could allocate according to family needs. Patricia continued managing my emotions as if I were incapable of processing difficult information independently. And Garrett continued expecting me to solve his problems as if he were still a dependent child rather than a grown man responsible for his own choices. The fourth lesson involved recognizing manipulation tactics that masquerade as love and concern. Phrases like, "family comes first," "blood is thicker than water," and "we all need to do our part," had been used to pressure me into sacrificing my well-being for other people's convenience. These weren't expressions of love, they were emotional manipulation techniques designed to override my rational decision-making process and appeal to guilt and obligation rather than genuine choice. Learning to identify these tactics allowed me to evaluate requests based on their actual merit rather than the emotional pressure accompanying them. When someone needs to use guilt, obligation, or emotional manipulation to gain compliance, it usually indicates that the request itself is unreasonable and wouldn't be accepted if presented honestly. The fifth insight was perhaps the most personally challenging, understanding that some people will only change when forced to by circumstances rather than convinced to by reason or love. For years, I had believed that if I just explained my concerns clearly enough, or if I just demonstrated enough patience and support, my family would eventually recognize the dysfunction in our patterns and choose to change. But people comfortable with dysfunctional systems rarely have motivation to change as long as those systems continue serving their needs. Raymond had no reason to develop financial responsibility as long as my savings account was available for emergencies. Garrett had no reason to address his gambling addiction as long as I was available to pay his debts. Patricia had no reason to develop direct communication skills as long as I was willing to absorb family stress and conflict. Only when I completely removed myself from the system did they become motivated to develop healthier patterns, because the dysfunction was no longer sustainable without my participation. This led to the sixth lesson about the courage required for authentic self-care. Self-care isn't just bubble baths and meditation retreats, it's making difficult decisions that prioritize your long-term well-being over other people's immediate comfort. Sometimes self-care means disappointing people who have become accustomed to your unlimited availability. Sometimes it means being called selfish by people who have benefited from your self-sacrifice. The most difficult aspect of choosing myself was overcoming the guilt that had been programmed into me since childhood about putting my own needs first. I had been taught that good daughters sacrifice for their families, that success creates obligation to help others, and that boundaries are evidence of moral failure. Unlearning these beliefs required conscious daily practice of prioritizing my own well-being without feeling guilty about it. 18 months after my disappearance from Millbrook, I received an unexpected email from Garrett himself. Unlike the manipulative messages I had anticipated, his communication was straightforward and accountable in ways I had never experienced from him before. "I wanted to update you on my progress and thank you for making the decision that probably saved my life," he wrote. "I'm approaching my first anniversary of gambling sobriety, and I understand now that every time you bailed me out, you were actually making it easier for me to continue destroying myself. I was angry at first when you disappeared, but I'm grateful now that you had the courage I didn't have." He included details about his new life that demonstrated genuine change rather than temporary improvement. He was working full-time as an assistant manager at a retail store, living within his means, and attending regular Gamblers Anonymous meetings. He had completed a financial literacy course and was making consistent payments toward his remaining debts without borrowing additional money. Most significantly, he asked nothing from me except acknowledgement of his progress, offering no requests for reconciliation or resumed contact. This restraint demonstrated a level of respect for my boundaries that felt genuinely different from his previous communications. But even this positive update didn't create pressure for me to reconnect with my family. I had learned that healing and forgiveness don't require resuming relationships that caused damage in the first place. I could appreciate their growth while maintaining the distance that allowed me to continue flourishing independently. My relationship with Daniel had evolved into something deeper and more secure than I had thought possible. We had moved into a larger apartment in Newbridge and were discussing marriage based on genuine partnership rather than neediness or convenience. Daniel had witnessed my family's dysfunction firsthand and supported my decision to maintain boundaries without pressuring me toward either reconciliation or permanent estrangement. Ashford Financial Consulting had exceeded my most optimistic projections, serving over 40 clients within its first year and generating enough revenue to support both my living expenses and aggressive savings for future goals. More importantly, I loved the work itself, helping people develop financial literacy and independence without creating dependent relationships or enabling poor decision-making. As I reflect on this journey from financial captivity to authentic independence, I'm struck by how dramatically life can change when you finally choose yourself over other people's expectations. The woman who fled Millbrook in the middle of the night was exhausted, resentful, and trapped by obligations that felt impossible to escape. The woman I've become is energized by genuine choices, supported by healthy relationships, and confident in her ability to maintain boundaries that protect her well-being. So what would you do if you faced a similar situation? Would you continue sacrificing your future to fund other people's mistakes, hoping that somehow the pattern would change? Or would you find the courage to walk away from dysfunction, even if it meant disappointing people who claim to love you? The most important thing I learned is that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling their worst behaviors by removing yourself from toxic dynamics entirely. Real change often requires disruption, and sometimes you have to save yourself before you can help anyone else. If my story resonates with your own experience of family dysfunction, financial exploitation, or boundary violations, I hope it gives you permission to prioritize your own well-being without guilt. You deserve relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. You deserve to keep the money you earn rather than funding other people's poor choices. And you deserve the freedom to build a life that reflects your own values and dreams rather than constantly managing other people's crises. Remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's essential. And sometimes the people who call you selfish for setting boundaries are simply upset that they can no longer exploit your generosity. That's their problem to solve, not yours to manage. Thank you for taking this journey with me. If this story helped you feel less alone in your own struggles with family boundaries and financial exploitation, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life experiences about building authentic independence. Sharing these stories helps others recognize that they have choices, even in situations that feel hopeless. Until next time, remember that your future matters more than other people's comfort with dysfunction. You have the right to choose freedom over obligation, and growth over stagnation. Choose yourself first, because you deserve that priority. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.